This
The young,
conference
smart
will
guy.
now be recorded.
Okay. I used to be the young guy. Now I was the old guy, and I worked with Molly Keene's mom for about 25 of the years of that 35 years. I was in Stoughton for about 10 years, just 2 towns over from you. And then I went 2 towns the other way in Needham for about 24 years. So I was in the system for a long time. I'm so happy to be talking to you because I love town employees. I was a town employee for so long. I left in 2017 to do a lot of consulting, and Aubrey and I have worked together. Sigal and I actually worked together many years ago, and I'm really happy to be here today and talking to you about mental health. So important to talk about, particularly now. Here's my contact information whenever I speak. If you have a question you want to email me about, you can email me. I will get right back to you. I'm not looking for any business. I'm not doing any individual therapy anymore. I will get back to you within the day. If you're on Twitter, I post things about mental health issues every day, so please feel free to do that. So we're going to jump right in. This training is a little bit different. So many of the trainings we do as town employees are to help you be better in your job, help with communication, help with the technical item. This is all about you and your mental health. And of course, it can help you in your job. It certainly can help you if you have people in your life, a parent, a child, cousins, that sort of thing. But this is just for you, and I'm so happy to be here. So, of course, context is everything, and COVID really shook our world, and it changed everything for us. And then, of course, racial justice and equity issues came in. And then just last night, I think we were all horrified to see what was happening in Washington, D.C. And all of these things really impact our mental health in very significant ways. So to say, oh, these just happen and they maybe happen in Washington or they don't impact me so much, we're seeing it, we're feeling it. We know people who are worried about COVID, for example. And this is why talking about mental health right now is so critically important. I'm so glad that you're with me today. So I'm going to grab a piece of paper because this is what our world was like. Our world before was flat. It was knowable. It was something that we all understood. Predictable. But this is what happened with our world. And our world literally has been crunched, just like this. Our world has been made small. And what we're trying to do as moms and dads and brothers and sisters and children and parents, whatever role you are playing, we're trying to get back to our normal way of life, our old norms. So I'm going to take this piece of paper and I'm going to unfurl it. And I'm going to try to get back to our old normal way of life. I'm going to use my knee for a second, try to get it back to its original form. This is what I've got. Not so good. You can see I have lines in there. As much as we want to get back to our normal way of life, we can't do that right now. And every line might represent something else. It might represent anger. It might represent anxiety. It might represent depression. So we have to keep this in mind. It's a great visual model. I do a lot of trainings for teachers. I know a lot of teachers that use this visual model, but our world literally was crunched, and this is how much we're trying to get back. So we're going to be talking about the issues that I mentioned in this conversation. But before we get started, I want to talk about what we've experienced. And in the very beginning, it was a sprint to acquire food, our homes, make them safe. At the same time, we knew it was a marathon. If you were a sprinter, you'd be training very differently than if you were a marathoner. We were doing both at the same time. And that's why it was so exhausting. I remember getting to bed one night and I said to my wife, I don't know why I'm so exhausted. I haven't left the house. I don't know why. And she said, because this is really hard. COVID is really hard. And of course, there was new loneliness and changing of norms. And just as we got our equilibrium together around COVID, again, racial equity issues were coming. And then again, last night, we were shaken again, changing the way we think, changing what we say, changing our behavior. And let's talk about what we have done. So in the very beginning, we heard this term social distancing. The first time I heard that, I flinched. We desperately need the social. That's what pulled us together in 9/11. That's what pulls us together all the time. We're really social beings. Believe it or not, it's fun to work at home, but I know a lot of you miss being in the office. So I like to use terms which are really more appropriate and descriptive. So physical distancing really captures it for me. And we knew all about quarantining. Oh, we had done that through the movies and watched it, but now we were doing it ourselves. It wasn't really a lot of fun. And our expectations were shifting, our lives were shifting. We were learning new ways to connect. Zoom and GoToMeeting and all those platforms were really fun in the beginning, not so much fun anymore. It's been really hard. And I know that teachers and town hall workers and all of us thought that we were remotely or virtually working. Well, I want to tell you, it's the one thing I'll tell you we're not right about. It was actually pandemic working. And I want to tell you what I mean by that. Remote learning or remote working means that it was practiced. You knew it was coming. Everyone was looking forward to it. But pandemic working means we had to pivot at a moment's notice using technology we had never used before under this incredible stressor of COVID-19. That's why we're so exhausted. That's why people are burned out. That's why it's been so difficult. And then we have the overlay of things like what we saw last night, things that are happening in our world, which in and of themselves can be exhausting. You can see the quote at the bottom by Dr. Fauci. I'm a big Fauci fan, I have to tell you. I don't know if you remember in the spring, they asked Fauci, if someone were to play you on TV or the movies, who would it be? And he said Brad Pitt. Lo and behold, 3 weeks later on Saturday Night Live, there was Brad Pitt playing Dr. Fauci. I don't know, Kate McKinnon played him a couple of weeks ago, so he took a couple of steps down, but it's pretty cool. And, you know, Dr. Fauci is someone who a lot of people admire. I'm such a nerd about Dr. Fauci. I went online. His birthday was in late December. You can probably still send him a gift. But this has been really hard, and that quote was really very iconic. And we've learned a lot. Interestingly enough, Google did an internal survey, and they found that there have never been more searches for panic or panic attacks or anxiety attacks than there have been in the last 9 to 10 months. Not really a surprise when you think about it. And we hear the term surge a lot. And of course, it was so terrible to read the people who are dying every day. You know, it was close to 4,000 people yesterday. That's just heartbreaking. And if you've lost anyone to COVID, I know in your town you had a serious outbreak in the beginning. You know, my heart goes out to you. I lost a distant relative to COVID. I lost a childhood friend. This has been really hard. And when we think about the word surge, which we heard a lot, we think about that surge of physical stuff, people getting sick, people dying. But I'm talking about the mental health surge today. And the mental health surge has told us a lot. For example, if you know anyone between the age of 18 and 24, 25% of that grouping has seriously considered suicide during the pandemic. Wow, 1 in 4. And we know from the CDC report in June that 31% of people say they have anxiety. That's why we're talking about it here today. 26% trauma. This is a traumatic time. And 11% have considered suicide during the pandemic of the entire population. So we know that this is very serious. And on some level, it's hard to do. But on another level, the best thing we have is talking about these issues, bring it out in the open. And we know from past tragedies and past traumas what has happened. We know from Puerto Rico, for example, when they had the hurricanes, the incidence of drinking, drugging, self-harm, anxiety, and suicide skyrocketed. And we know that in 2008, the last financial crunch, we had over 10,000 documented cases of suicide. So this is very real. And of course, it impacts people in very different ways. For our young people who have highly reactive brains, this has been hard. Our young people have been spared in terms of their body. COVID has not been as hard physically for them, but I believe it's going to be harder for them. It already is in terms of mental health. And we know that young kids, and you may have young people in your lives who are gay, lesbian, transgender, or any population who has a disability, or if you have an eating disorder, this has been an incredibly challenging time for people. If you have a pre-existing mental health condition, this has been really hard. So it's been hard for all of us. I'm not sure what group has had it hardest. Teachers, of course, were struggling in the spring. They're working so hard. Town hall workers worked incredibly hard. Obviously, I was one of you. I have such respect for what you've done. And if you've had low moments, that's called being normal. That's called being human. This is really tough. And I want to talk about resilience. You know, we talk about resilience a lot in education and psychology. And, you know, when we hear about resilience, we're talking about building ourselves up, being resilient to these tough times. And that's a great thing to strive for. We strive for that in the people that we interact with at work and people that we interact with in our personal lives. But just because you're resilient doesn't mean you're not hurting inside. Doesn't mean you have those lines like in the piece of paper I held up. So when we see people who are functioning very well and resilient, let's also understand that they can be hurting inside too. And you know, it'd be really easy for me to sit back and say, okay, everyone, let's just expect the unexpected. Come on, this is what town employees do. We're used to that sort of thing. That never worked for me. I like to know what is going on. I like to know what is laying out ahead of me. And we don't know. Contrast it to 9/11. If you were around then, in 9/11, we could get together. We could actually be with each other, hug each other. But this has been so hard. And COVID has been hard on town hall workers in ways that we couldn't even imagine a year ago, on budgets, on safety. The thought of working from home, that was just out of the question a year ago, but now that is a standard. And of course, there's been a division in every town that I've worked with in the last year or so about people working at home versus people who are working at work in that division. So there's a lot that we're unpacking, a lot we're learning, and a lot we're really facing in the months ahead. So I want to talk about town employees, and clearly I'm a big fan because I was one, but town employees really care a lot. We know that teachers got a lot of emphasis and a lot of recognition in the spring, and that's so great. I love teachers. Practically my whole family's in the teaching profession, but town hall employees were also getting identified, as were first responders, providing critical services, working so hard, being so selfless, having maybe families or responsibilities outside of work, yet still getting to work and getting things done, which was so important to do. And I'm so glad that that was happening. That doesn't often happen. So that was really lovely to see that happening. But town employees are human too. And town employees have feelings, and they have situations and relationship challenges, and maybe financial challenges, and of course, mental health challenges. So yes, you might have gotten to work, but behind that, you are maybe having a difficult time. And that's what this is all about today, talking about mental health, perhaps in ways you haven't heard before, being thoughtful about it, being intentional about mental health too. I also know that for some town employees who have young children, this was particularly hard, juggling children who are all of a sudden home, and dealing with those sort of things. And again, the focus today is not to solve every problem, but the focus today is to talk about some of these mental health challenges. And we were carrying around a lot. Town employees are incredibly resilient, are so strong. You're like warriors. You're carrying around a lot. And the suitcase really represents that. But like anything you carry around for any length of time, it gets tiring. It gets exhausting. It's really hard to do. And if you've had those moments that have been really hard, and those moments when you felt like, I just don't want to do this, I can't do this anymore, that is called being human. And let's talk about what we've all been through. And this is a grief and loss cycle or process. And I want to talk about what this is like. It's important to intellectualize a little bit and understand where we're at. So the very first stage is denial. And denial is like something like this. This can't be happening. This can't be true. Denial is a very important part. It acts as a shock absorber. Because if we had to assimilate all the difficult truths right away, it would literally knock us over. The next stage is anger. Who could you be angry at? A local leader, a state leader, a national leader. You could be angry at God. If there was a God, how could God allow this to happen? And then for a lot of people, there was guilt. I know I felt guilty. I wasn't doing enough. I wasn't contributing enough. And I read an article which talked about this and said, if you are home and being safe, that is a worthy contribution. And the next stage is depression. Oh, I felt that many times in the last 10 months. That grayness, that heaviness. And the final step is acceptance. And acceptance doesn't mean you like what's going on with COVID, you like what's going on in the world. It just means you're accepting it. At any point, you can cycle back to a previous stage. I have cycled back to anger probably 5,700 times for sure. And I've cycled back to depression also. But it's important to understand that there is a process for our grieving, and again, to intellectualize it a little bit. And you might remember this from psychology in high school or college. This is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This was actually from the 40s. So this is about 80 years old almost. And we were, of course, moving up the pyramid to higher levels. But COVID really knocked us down to some basic safety and stability things. But we're trying to claw our way up back to our old levels. And this has been one of the difficult times. We're trying to get back to our norms. And I think the new norms might be our regular norms for a long time. And that's really hard to hear, but I think that's really frustrating. And with all of this, is having an impact. And I want to start with young people, and we'll get to people our age here. So this is a youth risk behavior survey. And this is a survey that is done in Massachusetts every 2 years. We've been doing it for about 30 years or so. and they do it literally in every district. And these figures are BC, before coronavirus. And the reason why I'm pointing that out is because I believe that once we get some of the statistics around coronavirus and the impact, these numbers will double. I want to take a quick second and just go over it. So let's say, I can't remember at Norwood High School, I spoke there a couple years ago. I can't remember how many students go there, but we'll just say 1,000 just for the conversation of it. If I look at the number of students who have seriously considered suicide, 1,000 kids, that'd be 120 kids, or 150 kids who have self-injured. And we're going to be talking about these as we go along. Or think about it, over 100 who had a suicide plan, or 50 kids who attempted suicide. Wow, let's think about over 100 kids who had a suicide plan in your typical high school in Massachusetts. If I told you that over 100 kids in any district, in your town, anyone, had diarrhea, yeah, I did say diarrhea, you can imagine what they do. They close down Norwood High School, they scrub it from top to bottom. Can you see on Channel 5, diarrhea in Norwood? You'll be retired in Florida, Arizona, wherever you're going to retire many years from now, and someone will say, what did you do? Oh, I work for the town of Norwood. Was that the diarrhea place? No one would forget it. Well, again, diarrhea is not a lot of fun, but it's not going to end your life. And let's look at the impact on high school students and also college students. Some of these statistics I gave you before. You can look at 3 and 4 high school students who are experiencing stress or anxiety during COVID. Not really a surprise. Young people have a highly reactive brain. We used to think that young people weren't very smart. Oh, they're very smart. But young people have that highly reactive brain. And you can see about the 18 to 24 range, and also for college students. But let's take a look at where a lot of us are at, and let's look at mental health for people our age. So this slide was compiled before coronavirus, and I thought many times about changing it, but I think it's really important not to change it because I think it illustrates a lot. So you can see that 25% of adults experience a mental health condition. Oh, now we know from the latest statistics, that's up to 40%. So you see that one shaded area, that one figure? Now it's 2 of those are struggling with a mental health issue. As I said, 31% dealing with anxiety, 26% trauma. This is a traumatic time for us. So these numbers are going to explode, and you're not going to be a good partner. You're not going to be a good worker. You're not going to be good to yourself if your mental health is not really in a good place. And that's why we're here talking about it today. I'm so glad you're joining me here today. So, of course, one of the things that we deal with in mental health a lot is depression. Depression is a very treatable mental health challenge. And here are some of the signs. I just wanted to throw this slide in of someone who is depressed. Now, some of these may seem familiar to you. Maybe you've had some of those. But we define depression in terms of length and depth. So if these have been happening for more than a 2-week period and keeping you from the things that you normally do, then it's really time to really look at that and maybe seek some help. Unfortunately, when we are hurting, we try to gravitate to something that will make us feel better. And some of those things are easy and some are available, but they're hollow calories, as I call them. They're hollow gratifications. And they're things which actually might feel good in the moment, but they don't really help us in the long term. And you can see on there about eating and self-injury and suicide. And someone asked me recently, so if I have a bowl of ice cream, does that mean that that's a bad thing? No. If you're having 7 bowls of ice cream, that could be problematic. And I want to talk about some of the things on this list, and I want to start with self-injury. Self-injury is cutting, burning, ingesting. Why would people self-injure? Well, they self-injure because they tell us that pain is better than nothing. They self-injure because they tell us it expresses outwardly, say by a cut on their hand, that what they're feeling inside. And actually, they tell us that this is something that feels good for them. It's a very addictive behavior. And we know around self-injury that the more misery and the less connection, the more chance of self-injury. And we've had a very difficult time around connection right now. We know that. People who self-injure are actually optimistic. They feel a measure of control. And there is an overlap between suicide and self-injury, and it looks like this. Just because you self-injure doesn't mean you're going to be involved in suicidal thoughts or suicide attempts. But we know a significant percentage of people who do attempt to take their lives actually have self-injured. And let's talk about that. So in Massachusetts, If you're between the age of 45 and 54, I'm guessing several people, many people are in that age group. That number in a typical year for boys and men and girls and women has the highest number of completed suicides in Massachusetts. Wow, over 600. So let's think about that. We're always thinking about young people. It's such a tragedy when a young person ends their life, but it's actually different populations who are impacted. And I want to talk about some of the things on this slide. Also, I want to remind you at the end, you will be able to ask questions. I'm happy to answer questions at the end. So hold them to the end so I can see them. But please, I'm leaving about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So let's talk about lettuce. Why would we talk about lettuce? I want to tell you why. Remember about 2 years ago that the CDC said don't eat romaine lettuce. Why? We could get E. coli. You couldn't get it anywhere. I remember my wife and I were going to meet my father-in-law and his wife in southern New Hampshire, Tuscan Kitchen. If you've ever been there, it's a great restaurant. They have great Caesar salad. And as we were driving up, it dawned on me, I will not be getting a Caesar salad. I didn't know how I could face my father-in-law without good food. Yeah, you couldn't get it anywhere. My wife and I were cleaning out our refrigerator, and because the CDC said not only throw it out, but clean your refrigerator. I said to my wife, damn, that CDC is powerful. We haven't cleaned this refrigerator in a decade, and we're cleaning it out. Well, every life is important. No life is more important than the next. But I want to tell you, every year, less than 100 die of E. coli. Less than 100. Let's talk about Fenway Park. All right, I know we're not seeing the Red Sox. They've been really lousy anyway. So let's pretend they were good, and let's pretend we were in Fenway Park on a beautiful day, and it was safe. And imagine looking to your left and looking to your right and looking in the dugout, looking at everyone in that stadium. Now let's add 8,000 people to that figure for about 45,000 people. That's a number of people that die by suicide every year in this country, 45,000. Let's go back to the lettuce example. We got an alert from the CDC for less than 100 people. Again, every life is important. No life isn't more important than the next. We have never gotten an alert about suicide, ever. If someone were to break into your home, you would call 911. You would get immediate service. Starting next year, if you are worried about yourself or someone in your life, all you need to do is dial 988. That will be the emergency suicide number. And let's talk a little bit about populations who are at risk and what we can do about it. So if you're a white male, 50 and older, I'm in that category. That group is increasing the most in terms of suicidal ideation, the thoughts of suicide, suicide attempts, and completed suicide. And we want to use proper terms. You don't want to say successful suicide. It's not a success. We say completed suicide. We don't even say committed suicide anymore. That's like committed a crime, committed a felony. We might say died by suicide. So these are really important things to know about. And I want to tell you a story about a guy by the name of Kevin Hines. Kevin was a guy, like a lot of suicidal people, who thought the world would be better without him. He felt he was a burden to himself. And one of the mantras about suicide is, it's not that people want to die. It's that they can't figure out a way to go on living. And this was true for Kevin. He couldn't. And he decided he was going to end his life. The world would be better without him. And he was on a public bus going to the single place in this country where the most number of suicide attempts and completed suicides have happened. And that's the Golden Gate Bridge. Built in the 30s, a scene of thousands of suicide attempts. Only about 25 has survived. And Kevin was on a public bus and he's weeping openly, saying to himself over and over, if someone will ask me, am I all right? I won't do it. Because again, he didn't want to die. He just didn't know how to ask for help. Nobody said a word. He had to transfer buses and get on another bus. He's openly weeping on this bus. Please, somebody notice, I'm in pain. I get it. It's hard to know what to say to someone who is having that kind of reaction in a public way. The bus comes to a halt and he senses somebody is looming over him. And he says to himself, thank God, I'll be saved. It was the bus driver. And the bus driver says, it's the end of the line. You got to get off. Nobody notices. Nobody cares. I am going to end my life. And he starts walking up that bridge. And as luck would have it, there was a tourist who had a camera and shoved it in his face and said, take my picture. But they never asked how he was. Now I'm going to end my life, he says to himself. And he looks out and he jumps off that bridge. As I told you, thousands have attempted. Only about 25 have survived. It takes 4 seconds by the time you jump off that bridge till you hit the water. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hits the water, he goes down 80 feet. I don't know about you, but when I'm 5 feet under, I'm freaking out. He's 80 feet under. His first thought is, am I alive? His second thought is, thank God I'm alive. Let's think about that. Moments ago, he wanted to end his life, and for all intents and purposes, he was going to end his life. Almost nobody survives. But he's 80 feet under, and he's a broken man, literally 100 broken bones. His eardrums are burst. He doesn't even know which way is up, which way is down. And finally, he claws his way to the surface, and he pops out of the water, and he's exuberant. And now he's got a problem. He's in the middle of the San Francisco Bay. Did anyone see him jump off? He knows he can't swim. He's a broken man, and he feels this slamming him in the back. And then again, and again, and again. And now he realizes what is happening. He has somehow survived jumping off that bridge, but he's going to get eaten by a shark. This is insane. How could this happen? So, come on, we're close enough to water in Massachusetts. If a shark attacks you, we all have seen Shark Week, you take and you punch it in the nose. So he's flailing at this creature to try to keep himself alive. But again and again and again, he's getting attacked. There's a boat that comes out, and that boat has body bags, because they almost never find someone alive. And they see him thrashing about in the water, and they're trying to get there as fast as they can, and Kevin has no idea that they're coming. They finally get there, and they pull him up, and they throw him on the boat, and they say, do you know what happened? But his eardrums are burst, he can barely hear, and they start screaming, do you know what happened? And he says, yes, I jumped off the bridge. No, do you know what happened in the water? Yeah, that shark was going to eat me. And that was no shark. Oh, believe me, that was a shark. No, we saw the whole thing. Here's what happened in the water. You could not keep yourself afloat. Every time you sunk below the surface, that was a sea lion that pushed you to the surface, kept you alive. Well, the takeaway is really obvious. We all, and I'm pointing to myself too, we all need to do a better job when people in our lives are hurting. And I want to tell you a story about a relative of mine who was really in a tough place. And he came to me one day and he says, you know what? I can't take it anymore. I just want to kill myself. I want to end it. I want out. And I want to tell you what happened during this conversation. The very first thing I did, I started to cry. If that has ever happened to you when you get emotional, that's called just being normal, being human. The next thing I did, I said, thank you. I wanted to acknowledge what I heard. And if I wasn't trained and do what I do, I probably would have said something like, you don't mean that, or things will get better, all well-intentioned. But that actually would not have been very helpful. And I'm so glad I do what I do professionally, because I've said the 3 most important words to this relative that I've ever said. And I hope you'll always remember it. And it's this: tell me more. And they said, what do you mean tell you more? I said, you've just told me you want to end your life. Tell me more. We want to open up conversation. I know it seems scary to do that, to open up conversation, but we have to open up conversation and we have to talk about it. So just a couple quick myths and facts about suicide. When I was in graduate school, they said, don't talk about suicide. You'll plant the seed. We know that's silly. And then they said, well, have people sign a contract. They won't hurt themselves. They won't take their lives. Doesn't really work very well. Here are some things you can do if you're worried about someone. Give them some resources. Say to them, if you thought about ending your life, tell me 3 things you would do to keep yourself alive. I would tell you, I would call a hotline. I would call my therapist. Those are much more helpful. So we have to understand that suicide is something that impacts all of us. It's the 10th leading cause of death in this country. Oddly enough and happily enough, in the last year, in 2019, suicide decreased just by a little bit. And COVID is probably going to push suicide back to number 11 for a year period of time. But it will be coming back because it is increasing, especially because of COVID. And we know in some states, suicide is now the 8th leading cause of death. And I want to tell you very quickly, Massachusetts has a low completion rate for suicide. And by that, I mean, when we look at suicide attempts versus completed suicide, we're low. And the reason for that is gun control. States which have more restrictive gun control laws have lower rates of completed suicide. Vermont, I do a lot of presenting up in Vermont. Their gun control laws are more lax than ours. Their suicide completion rate is twice what it is in Massachusetts. So we know that access to a bridge or a gun, we know that these things are very real. Let's talk about anxiety. I know even hearing that word can make people anxious. It makes me anxious. I'm an anxious person. About 2 years ago, my wife told me I was an expert in anxiety, which I thought was hysterical. I said, why do you think I'm an expert? She said, oh, you make me anxious all the damn time. So I guess I'm an expert in that way. I also tell stories about my wife and kids. I'm going to be doing that in a moment. They all know I'm doing that, so I just wanted to mention that. And I want to talk about some of the things on this list. But before I do that, I want to say anxiety is like that alarm that goes off, even though there's nothing happening. Perhaps you've had your smoke detector go off and there's nothing happening. That's what it feels like. And anxiety is powerful. And anxiety lies to us. Anxiety tells us it's always going to be there. And when anxiety competes with almost anything else and is out of control, it almost always wins. My son Jake wanted to be in the starting lineup for the Belmont High School varsity basketball team. He got there because he's a really good player, but he's also an anxious kid. And when his anxiety kicked in on Tuesday and Friday nights when we played basketball in Massachusetts, he was terrible. My wife would say, "Why is Jake so bad?" I said, "That's not Jake out there. That's his anxiety." So if you have colleagues who deal with anxiety, they're not performing as well. They're not hearing as well. We know that for students, it's like a learning disability. You can't incorporate the information. And I want to talk about some of the things on this list, like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Wait a second. We associate that with washing our hands, but shouldn't we be doing that a lot? Yeah, people who have OCD have been triggered. And we know people who had never had OCD suddenly have that. Panic attack or panic disorders. I want to tell you a story about my wife and her panic attack. It happened about 2 years ago. My wife woke up at 5:28 in the morning in full panic mode. And she said, "I'm having a heart attack. We have to go to the hospital." And even though I adore my wife, I want to tell you what happened. I immediately abandoned her and I ran down to the kitchen. And I wish I had a camera because what happened next was really fascinating and a little comical too. I had a plan. And I went into the freezer and I grabbed some ice cubes and I ran upstairs and I said, "Hold these ice cubes." And the very first thing she said to me, and why I wish I had a camera, she looked at me and she said, "I hate living with a therapist." I've heard that many times from my kids, but never from my wife. I said, "Just hold the darn ice cubes." And she held the ice cubes, and I could see her anxiety going down. You can only be in an anxious state for about 20 or 25 minutes. Our bodies literally cannot take it. And about 5 minutes after that, she says, "My hands are freezing. I can't hold these much longer." I said, "Just hold the ice cubes." I saw her anxiety decrease. And a couple of minutes after that, she says, "You don't understand. I cannot hold these a moment longer." I said, "Okay, you can get rid of them." And this is where I wish I had the camera. She literally threw them at me. I was recalibrating her brain. 2 months ago, my computer crashed. I'm sitting right where I'm sitting now. I got up to my freezer and grabbed ice cubes for myself. I was having a panic attack, which was so reliant on that. And let's talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. We are living through trauma right now. There is no timeline for PTSD. As people come back to work, it's going to be hard. And a sight, a sound, a smell can trigger someone. So we have to have a lot of empathy for people. Again, no one would wish it on someone else. And this has been very hard for people. And here are some of the signs of anxiety. We have some productive anxiety or productive worries. And that usually means that we're resolving an issue, we're getting to a place. And then we have what I generally have, and those are unproductive things where I'm just spinning my wheels all the time. That's really hard. And here's some of the physical signs. I told you about some of the things my wife was dealing with. Really felt like she was having a panic attack. Probably with the number of people on here, I would say at least a third of you have had a panic attack, and probably the other 2/3 have witnessed someone having a panic attack. And anxiety to me is like an iceberg. We see the behavior on the top, and I'm going to talk about my own anxiety. When I'm anxious, I overplan. Like I'm always asking, what are we doing? Where are we going? That sort of thing. And I'll give you a really concrete example. When I go to a restaurant, okay, I'm not going to restaurants too much now, but when I go to a restaurant, and I've even been there 5 or 10 times, I'm an anxious guy. I will still go online and I will look at the menu. My son is a lovely kid. When he's anxious, he is defiant, he is rude. So when we see this behavior in ourselves or people in our lives or the people we work with, let's look below the surface and understand that there's probably a lot going on. And it's kind of like an escalator. Anxiety escalates from something benign to something more out of control. But the reality is that we are in a state now where we're about halfway up the escalator. And things like last night, watching the images of DC, certainly can escalate our anxiety in and of themselves. And I know a lot of people here know anxious people, work with anxious people, And sometimes we don't say the right things to an anxious person. Like, for example, we might say, it's not a big deal, or get over it. Or here's my favorite one, it's all in your head. Well, of course it's all in your head. That's what anxiety is all about. But it's not so easy to know the proper things to say. And I want to talk about some of these things. And I'll use a story about my son, Jake, again. Such an anxious kid when he was in high school. And he wouldn't talk to me. I'm his dad. I'm a therapist. Who the heck is going to talk to me? And finally, I said to him, all right, Jake, I want you to scale it for me. 1 being the best, 10 being the worst. I want you to tell me what you are every day. He said, okay, Dad, I'll do that. Just leave me alone. He would tell me, say, on a Wednesday, he's a 5. On a Thursday, maybe he was an 8. And I could say to him, what would have to happen in your life, Jake, for you to become a 5 again? Well, I didn't tell him this, but I charted every day what he was. I put that number on a calendar because I knew there was a pattern. I just didn't know what the pattern was. Not a surprise. Sundays, most anxious day of the week. Think about academic challenges, social challenges, athletic challenges. For me, as an adult, my most anxious day of the week was Sunday also. They call it the Sunday scaries. So it's really helpful to do that. With my wife and I, when I'm having an anxious day and I'm not listening as well because you can't hear as well, I'll say like I'm an 8, which is a signal to her like, you know what, I'm not really comprehending this. Don't count on me for very much. And recalibrating the brain is really important. Like I said before, we did that with the ice cubes. And like, for instance, I'm going to do it right now for 10 minutes. So I'm going to ask you just to be silent for 10 seconds. Go. And what we're hearing. There was an airplane outside. There must have been like a honking of a car horn outside too. Again, that's recalibrating their brain. So we know this if you're a parent or if you're in any kind of role at work, modeling calm behavior is really important. Previewing is important, just like I preview the menu a little bit. So this has been really hard, and knowing the right things to say are so important to do. And this is a hard slide for me because I had to limit it to my top 10. Anxiety is different for everyone. And anxiety is really about learning to live with the discomfort. We're not magically going to get rid of it. If you have a student who's in high school and thinks, oh, when I go to college, it's going to be magically over. Or perhaps you're in another job and you thought, oh, when I start to work for Norwood, I won't have to deal with my anxiety. No, anxiety doesn't go away on its own. We know that to be true. And as a parent, I try not to pass along my anxiety. In my role, working for the town of Needham, I had a staff I supervised. I didn't want to pass along my anxiety either. I wanted to model good behavior. Again, using distractions are really important. I wish I had figured out about those fidget spinners. I probably would have made a lot of money, or using ice cubes or that sort of thing. And you can see on there about asking professional assistance. Imagine if you broke your leg and you waited 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 years, or never to get help. No, that's ludicrous. We don't do that. That's what we do around depression, and that's what we do around anxiety. We're so good in our culture with things from the neck down. We're not so good from the neck up. And debriefing after an incident. So I'm going to go back to the story about my wife and her panic attack. I finally said to her about 15 hours later when we were getting into bed, you know what? I want to talk about what happened. I want to know what I did well, what I didn't do well. I'll be honest with you, she groaned. She didn't want to talk about it, but it was really important to debrief, especially when you've had an anxious situation that has gone well, that has been handled well. And if we focused in on all the things we can't control all the time, it would drive us batty. There's a lot we can't control in the world. And anxiety is all about feeling out of control. And town employees are really good at so many things. I just put together this list. I probably could have done 3 slides about this. You're so good at things. I wanted to honor you and recognize all that you've done. But I want to tell you something you're really bad at. You're really bad at self-care. You're caring for other people in your job, in your personal life. That is the public mentality. You're not so good at that. So we really want to talk about the importance of self-care. And when I heard about self-care about, 20 or 30 years ago, I kind of laughed to myself. It seemed indulgent. It seemed selfish. Well, self-care is not selfish at all. Self-care is really important to do. And self-care is something we don't really do enough. And self-care is about relieving the burden. It shouldn't be a reward. It shouldn't be a treat. It needs to be intentional. And you can see on this list about saying no. Town employees, we're not so good at saying no. We're always volunteering. We're always doing things. We don't know our boundaries because we're always helping people. So self-care is really important. I want to talk about self-care. And this is a list of some things about self-care. You can see laughing is on the list. One of the great lines I saw during the pandemic was Adam Sandler said that the American educational system wasn't designed with the thought that I'd be teaching math to my kids. We need to laugh. Of course, these are horrific things, but we need to laugh. Go on YouTube and type in laughing circles or laughing therapy, and you'll see people in a circle laughing. And it seems hokey and stilted at first, but then it's pretty fun. Mindfulness. If you practice mindfulness, there's so many great apps around that. Like Calm is one app that I think about. So important to do. Therapy should not be stigmatized in any way. Some of the strongest people I know are people who actually say, I'm hurting, I need help. And along with that, medication. Why would napping be self-care? Yeah, napping is important to do. Having good sleeping, healthy eating. We know in Massachusetts that sales of alcohol has skyrocketed. Now, I suppose it's possible that people are buying alcohol and putting it in their basement, but I suspect not. I suspect people are drinking it. And let's talk about self-generosity. I want to tell you what I mean by that. We know about generosity around this time of the year. You know, we might have donated money or time to a cause that's important to us. But self-generosity means not being hard on ourselves. Maybe you haven't been the best worker. Maybe you haven't been the best mom or dad or brother or sister or parent or whatever roles that you play. But people who are self-generous don't beat themselves up. If you're beating yourself up, that is the opposite of self-care. And we know that the happiest people are people who live in the moment. I'm not so good at it. I really have to push myself. We also know if you're a perfectionist, it's really hard to practice self-care and to not have anxiety because we want to get to perfection. But you know what? I'm not so sure anyone can ever get to perfection. And even if you get there, I don't know if you can actually stay there. Let's talk about exercising. Now, it seems really simple, but I can tell you when I exercise, about half of the time is the worst thing for me. Because when I'm exercising, my anxiety takes over. I'm not doing self-care at all. So understand that self-care is what it is for you. And our buckets of self-care are changing. What may have worked for you before may not be accessible. Like I love going to the gym. I can't go to the gym anymore. And you can see some of the other things on here like faith. Volunteering is not quite as easy to do. Being outside and in nature is the least expensive and easiest self-care strategy of all time. I also think if you have access to a fire pit, it's a great time of year to do it. It's not light out very long and it's cold. Use a fire pit and bring some light and some warmth into your life. So I'd like to ask you, if I can, to write in on the chat some of the things that you do for your own self-care, because I think this is really important to hear from you. So if you can take a second and just type in what you do for your self-care, I'd really appreciate that. That'd be really great. So I'll wait for some of those to come in. Again, asking you what you do for your self-care. A pedicure. Yes, that is self-care. Other people, what do you do? A hike, being outside. Yes, snuggling, with your cat. Let's talk about animals. Animals are great self-care. They love us when sometimes we don't even love ourselves. Cooking. I have never baked before. I had baked during the pandemic. I got to tell you, I'm no threat to anybody to take over, but I can tell you it was really fun. Reading a book for a lot of people is really great. For some people, that doesn't work. I see a face mask on there. If that works for you, fine. Walking on a beach. Your self-care is really important. I was doing a training for about 100 teachers, and a teacher wrote in taking a bath. And I thought to myself, I had not taken a bath in like 30 years. I've given my kids lots of baths when they were younger. So I took a bath. I had not taken a bath in like 30 years. That was really nice. Being in the bath, being warm, watching a show alone, I see on there. Yeah, we haven't had much alone time. That's been really hard. And I want to share with you some of the things that I have done for my self-care. When I'm really struggling and I know practicing my self-care is important, I want to do things which are accomplishable. So the very first thing I do in the morning is make my bed. If my mom were alive, she'd be hysterical because I never made my bed. We fought about it all the time. But making your bed has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And here are 2 projects that I did. I'm not very good, but I like doing them, beginning, middle, and end. I needed an outdoor little thing next to a bench, and I went online and it said if you dump some cement and some water and a couple of dowels in a Home Depot bucket, leave it for 3 days, this is what you'll get. And this is what I have. If you look really closely, you can see that the right-hand side of that is a little slimmer than the left-hand side of it. It's a little thicker. And my shed is on like a little slant. And my wife looked at it and she says, that would drive me crazy. She's a perfectionist. Really hard for her to practice her self-care. I'm not a perfectionist, so this was fine for me. And on the left-hand side, I have a cabin near Northampton, and I needed a light, so I got an Edison bulb, and I took some chicken wire, and I wrapped it around, and within about 15 minutes, I had a light. So really important to think about self-care things which are doable, which are achievable. Okay, so let's do this. I'm just clicking in here. We already did the self-care strategies. Let's talk about some of the care that you have in your community. Here are some of the supports that you have in Norwood. I want to point out that the William James Interface Referral Network, if you are a resident of Norwood or perhaps in a surrounding town like Needham, we brought that to Needham, this is a place that you can contact and they will find therapists for you. These are supports that you have to use, including Aubrey and what she does in her organization. So please take advantage of this. Again, some of the strongest people I know are people that do this. And here are some national resources. You don't have to be suicidal to contact the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. And texting, at first when I heard that, I thought that's ridiculous. We're texting about like suicide and crisis. No, these are very helpful. You can also see that self-injury and eating disorders are up there. Eating disorders have the highest mortality rate of any diagnosed mental health disorder. And we know within that suicide is the #1 reason why people die who have an eating disorder. So that's why I put it up there. Okay, so I told you we were going to have time at the end for some questions. So what I am hoping to do, and you can send it privately to me if you're not comfortable sending it publicly, feel free to ask some questions, and I'm happy to answer questions. It could be about someone in your life. It could be about you. Again, you can do it publicly so everyone can see, or if you're more comfortable, do it privately so only I will see it. And I'll take a couple of minutes, say the next 5 or 7 minutes, to answer any questions that come in. It's a really good time to ask questions. You don't really have an opportunity to do this, so I'm hoping that you're thinking about a question and perhaps you'll do it. I'll also ask Aubrey if she wants to come back and maybe start us off and ask a basic question that maybe is a typical question that is on people's mind. If you want to do that, Aubrey, you could certainly do that too while we're waiting for some questions to come in. Well, I'll start out and I'll say one of the questions I get a lot about is anxiety. And as I said before, anxiety is probably not going to go away on its own. It's great. It's just magical thinking to think that it will go away. It does take work. It does take some intentionality, but people can make great headway around anxiety. And so I really want to encourage you, if you're anxious, if you know someone who's anxious, really seek out help. This doesn't have to be your life. It is exhausting to have anxiety. So I did have a question. What exactly does holding the ice cube do while having a panic attack? Okay, well, here's what it does. When we are having a panic attack, our brain has been hijacked. Literally, it has been hijacked. And we cannot get to a logical thought process when our brain is hijacked. So holding ice cubes is hijacking our brain back again, bringing us into the moment. I guarantee you, if you hold ice cubes for long enough, your hands will be freezing and you want to be back in the moment. And that is what it's all about. So I have another one which says someone has a coworker who suffers with anxiety and comes and talks to the person about it. It makes you anxious to hear that. Yeah. So first of all, in your role, you are to be a good coworker, but you're not supposed to be a therapist. If it is triggering you, and that is actually pretty normal if it triggers you, that's a sign that you really need to give people resources. So people who are having anxiety are looking for help in all sorts of ways. It's good that they're actually coming to you. We want to acknowledge that. We want to support that. So saying something like, I'm glad you're coming to me, that's really great, but I really feel like I'm not the perfect person to come to. Let's strategize about how you can get help. And maybe you heard that person say like, oh, I only want to come to you, I only trust you. I get that, but your role is not to be a therapist. I also have to tell you as a therapist, it's hard to help someone with anxiety too. It's very possible and it's very doable, and it is a very possible to get someone to a better place if they want to do the work. So understanding where you are and what you can do and your role is really important, but acknowledge the person. Say, I'm so glad you told me that. Let's think about what we can do to help you. Let's look at some strategies. And you have some great resources in your community. like the William James referral service, which is a great place to start to try to find a therapist who will take your insurance, who specializes in that sort of treatment. Any other questions before we do the wrap up? We'll wait a second if anyone has any other questions. All right, so we'll just kind of continue down here if a question comes up. There are reasons to be hopeful. I know last night was totally demoralizing, triggering a lot of our anxiety, a lot of our collective depression. That's been really hard. But different than just about any other time in history, we're all in this together. And we're all seeing this together on TV. We're all experiencing COVID together. So that's very different than experiencing things alone. So often with mental health issues, we do feel so alone. We're all together. And there has been an increased emphasis about the importance of mental health. That's been a big change. We've seen that in schools. I've done many of these for town halls. This would have been town employees. This would have been unthinkable 10, 15 years ago. Now I hope it's something that's going to happen more and more. And we know that therapeutics are becoming more effective and a vaccine and distribution are happening, even in Norwood, I understand, which is fantastic. And we've made it this far, thus far, which is amazing. Had I described our life today to you a year ago, you would have thrown me out of the room. It was totally impossible. But we've done an amazing job. And it seems self-congratulatory, and perhaps it is, but we have to pat ourselves on the back. But we still have a ways to go. Even when COVID has really been tamped down or extinguished, we know the mental health challenges will exist. There is no timeline for how this will impact us. So let's have empathy for ourselves, and let's have empathy for the people we work with, and let's be a good coworker, but not a therapist. So I'm going to ask Aubrey to come back and maybe wrap it up here. I know you're lurking in the background somewhere, Aubrey.
I'm here. Just thank you so much for taking the time to speak to all of us today, and thank you to everybody who was able to attend. This will be recorded, so if there are others in your department that were unable to attend live, they can certainly listen to it. John also did a podcast with me a few weeks ago, so that has some really great information. If you want to listen to that, it's up on our website.
And just one thing, I'll interrupt you, Aubrey. If you can just type into the chat what you like, learned, or thought of, that will give Aubrey a little bit of a sense of what this was like. So, sorry, Aubrey, go ahead.
No, that's okay. I don't think I have anything else to add. I think just remember it's okay to not be okay all the time. We're all human. And I'm going to let Molly just say a few things before we close.
Yeah, I just want to close and sort of echo everybody who's thanking John. I know you've given us a lot to think about, and I think the real goal here that Aubrey and I have is to destigmatize, having conversations about mental health, and that it is okay not to be okay, and you have to take care of yourselves first before you can take care of your coworkers, before you can take care of your residents. So I'm so happy that you all were able to join us today, and I look forward to seeing you all next Thursday, same time, same place, new face, as we continue the series.
Great. Well, thank you, Molly, and thank you, Aubrey. It's been great working with you, and perhaps we'll work together again.
Most definitely.
Thanks so much.
All right. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, Aubrey. I'll email you.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.